My son drained every cent I had to play pretend for his new wife. They thought they could pack my bags and toss me out of what they called their home. But the look on their faces when they found out who actually held the deed to that luxury estate was something I will savor for the rest of my days. My name is Clarice. I am 65 years old, and for over 4 decades, I walked the unforgiving floors of Mercy General as a head nurse. I took on double shifts, rubbing the deep ache out of my swollen feet every single night, all to give my only son Jamal the life I never had. Raising a young black man on your own takes a special kind of grit. I poured every ounce of my soul into putting him through top-tier business programs. I made sure he had the sharpest suits, the best education, and a mother who loved him beyond measure. I would have handed that boy the moon if he asked for it. But unconditional love means nothing to a child who mistakes your devotion for weakness. The brutal reality check came on Thanksgiving morning. I was in the kitchen up since dawn, basting the turkey and preparing the candied yams and collard greens just the way Jamal used to love. The house smelled of cinnamon and memories. Suddenly, the kitchen door pushed open. Jamal walked in with his new wife Chloe, stepping in right behind him. They did not come to offer help or give thanks. Without a single word of greeting, Jamal dropped a scuffed duffel bag right at my feet. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, sickening thud. I looked from the bag to my son, wiping my hands on my apron, waiting for an explanation. Instead, Chloe crossed her arms and rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, impatient sigh. Jamal looked at me with eyes so empty and cold that I did not recognize the man standing in front of me. He told me my presence was stifling their marriage. He said they needed their space to host their friends, and that I was completely dragging down their lifestyle. Then he shoved a cheap, glossy brochure into my trembling hands. It was for a run-down state-funded assisted living facility on the worst side of town. He looked at the duffel bag and told me the cab was already waiting outside. Looking back at those days, I can still feel the cold, harsh linoleum of the hospital floors beneath my feet. Being a head nurse at Mercy General was not just a job. It was a calling that demanded every ounce of my physical and mental strength. For over 40 years, I worked double shifts, pulled holiday coverage, and picked up overtime whenever the hospital was short-staffed. Raising a young black man in this world on your own is a terrifying and beautiful responsibility. And I was utterly determined that Jamal would never lack for anything that truly mattered. I wanted him to have the kind of education that opens doors before you even have to knock. I remember missing out on so much of my own life just to make ends meet. I missed neighborhood barbecues, church socials, and peaceful Sunday mornings, just so I could put away another couple of $100 into his college fund. There were times my legs ached so badly I had to soak them in warm water and Epsom salts for hours before I could even stand up to cook our dinner. But every single time I looked at Jamal doing his homework at the kitchen table, I knew the sacrifice was entirely worth it. I wore the same grey winter coat for 12 years and drove a practical little sedan until the engine finally gave out. I made sure my boy went to the best business school in the state, and I paid for his tuition in cash and sweat. He graduated with high honors, and seeing him walk across that stage in his cap and gown was the proudest moment of my entire existence. I truly thought I had given him the ultimate foundation for a successful and honest life. But while Jamal thought I was just a hard-working nurse scraping by on a modest salary, he had absolutely no idea about the true nature of my finances. Growing up with nothing teaches you to value everything you earn. I never cared about flashy jewelry, expensive handbags, or keeping up with the neighbors. Instead, I learned how money actually works. Every time I worked a double shift, I took that extra money and invested it quietly. I read financial books during my 15-minute breaks at the hospital. I learned about real estate market trends and generational wealth. Decades ago, I established a blind trust and a real estate limited liability company. I bought modest properties when the market was low, fixed them up, and rented them out to reliable families. The rental income went straight back into the trust, multiplying year after year. I built a silent, formidable empire while wearing orthopedic shoes and blue hospital scrubs. I chose to keep my wealth a complete secret from everyone, including my own son. I wanted Jamal to build his own work ethic from the ground up. I wanted him to understand the value of a dollar earned through dedication rather than waiting around for a handout from his mother. I played the part of the modest retiree living on a fixed income perfectly, because I believed that invisible wealth gave me the power to protect him from the shadows. I planned to leave him a vast empire when I eventually passed away, hoping he would be mature enough by then to handle it wisely. For a long time, I believed my plan was working exactly as I intended. Jamal secured a good job at a marketing firm and started making his own way in the corporate world. I was so incredibly proud of the man he was becoming. He was respectful, grounded, and highly ambitious. But looking back, I realize I protected him so much from the struggles of poverty that I failed to prepare him for the corrupting influence of superficial greed. My blind trust continued to grow, and I was content in my quiet life, watering my plants, reading my books, and volunteering at the local community center. I thought my rigorous job as a provider was finally done. I thought I could finally rest and watch my son build a beautiful, meaningful life of his own. I was profoundly, sadly wrong. The foundation I built was strong, but I drastically underestimated how quickly a person can change when they are introduced to a world of hollow glamour and fake prestige. The sweet boy I raised to value hard work and integrity was slowly fading away, replaced by a man I barely recognized. The shift in my son did not happen overnight, but it certainly accelerated the moment he introduced me to his new wife, Chloe. She was a woman who valued appearances above absolutely everything else. From the moment she stepped into my modest home, I could see her scanning my outdated furniture and simple decor with thinly veiled disdain. Chloe came from a world of country clubs and maxed out credit cards, always needing to project an image of supreme wealth. Along with Chloe came her white American brother, Brad. Brad was an arrogant, entitled man who fancied himself an entrepreneur despite a string of failed businesses. He carried himself with a smug superiority that grated on my nerves instantly. Brad would frequently come over to the luxury estate they later acquired, and he treated everyone around him like the hired help. He would sit on the furniture with his shoes on, drink my specialty teas without asking, and make condescending remarks about my simple lifestyle. The changes in Jamal began shortly after he married into Chloe's family. My son, who used to be perfectly happy with a reliable car and a good book, suddenly became obsessed with status. He started wearing suits that cost more than my first car, and sporting designer watches that screamed for attention. He talked constantly about networking optics and building his brand. It broke my heart to see the boy who used to help me wash dishes transform into someone who was embarrassed by his mother's modest lifestyle. Jamal desperately wanted to fit into Chloe and Brad's world of hollow prestige. He began taking out loans to fund luxury vacations and lease high-end vehicles. I watched from a distance, keeping my mouth shut, because I believed he needed to learn his own lessons. I thought the financial pressure would eventually snap him back to reality. But instead of waking up, Jamal decided to double down on the illusion. About a year after their wedding, Jamal came to my small house with a proposition that sounded like a dream come true. He sat at my kitchen table looking at me with those big, earnest eyes I loved so much. He told me that he and Chloe were leasing a massive, luxurious suburban estate. He painted a picture of a sprawling property with a beautiful garden and plenty of room. Then he took my hands and begged me to move into the guest suite of this new mansion. He said I had worked hard my entire life and that it was finally time for him to take care of me in my old age. He spun a beautiful tale about having family close by, about me not having to worry about maintaining my own house anymore. He told me it was his duty as a son to provide for his mother. Hearing those words filled my heart with an overwhelming sense of joy and validation. I truly thought my sacrifices had finally paid off, and that my son had grown into the responsible, loving man I always prayed he would become. I agreed to move in, thinking we were entering a beautiful new chapter of our lives together. I packed up my memories, sold my little house, and moved into the guest suite of that grand suburban estate. I thought I was walking into a haven of family love. I had absolutely no idea that I was walking directly into a carefully orchestrated trap. Jamal was not bringing me into his home out of love or duty. He was bringing me there because his facade was cracking, and he needed a convenient way to manage his mounting financial disasters. My presence was simply a tool for his grand illusion. I was a prop in their fake life, a built-in babysitter, and a silent financial buffer. The luxury estate was breathtaking with its high ceilings, marble floors, and manicured lawns, but it was entirely soulless. The warmth I expected from living with my son was completely absent. Instead, I found myself navigating a cold, sterile environment where I was expected to stay out of sight whenever Chloe and Brad hosted their pretentious friends. I swallowed my pride time and time again because I loved my son. I convinced myself that the awkwardness was just an adjustment period. I wanted so desperately to believe the beautiful lie Jamal had told me at my kitchen table, but the walls of that grand estate were closing in, and the sweet illusion of a loving family was about to shatter into a million jagged pieces, exposing the ugly, greedy truth hiding just beneath the surface. The guest suite was beautiful. I will not deny that. But beauty means absolutely nothing when you are treated like a ghost in your own family. The disrespect did not happen all at once. It crept in like a slow winter draft, chilling me to the bone before I even realized the window was open. Chloe started small. She would leave piles of Jamal's dry cleaning outside my bedroom door, with sticky notes telling me which shirts needed extra starch. Then it escalated. She would walk into my private space without knocking, complaining that the caterers she hired for her lavish weekend brunches were too expensive. She would sigh and say, "Wouldn't it just be easier if I prepared the hors d'oeuvres myself?" Well, since I had nothing else to do with my time anyway. I was a retired head nurse. I was a woman who used to manage 3 entire hospital wards and a staff of 50 professionals during the most grueling night shifts imaginable. And here was a young woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, treating me like the unpaid help. I bit my tongue. I chopped her vegetables, I ironed my son's shirts, and I kept my peace. I did it because I thought that was what a good mother did, to keep her son's home harmonious. But Chloe's passive-aggressive demands were absolutely nothing compared to the blatant disrespect of her brother Brad. Brad was a white American man who carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone who always had a financial safety net waiting to catch him. He practically lived at the estate, coming and going as he pleased. He made it a daily habit to wander into my guest suite, whenever he felt like it completely invading my privacy. I had a small collection of imported herbal teas, rare blends of chamomile and lavender that I had treated myself to after my retirement as a small luxury for my aching joints. Brad would stroll right in, brew himself a cup of my most expensive tea, and plop down heavily on my velvet armchair. He would rest his dirty sneakers right on top of my glass coffee table. When I politely asked him to remove his shoes, he would just smirk, take a loud sip of my tea, and completely ignore my request. One Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting by the window reading my Bible, when Brad invited himself in. He poured his tea, kicked his feet up on my fresh linens, and looked around my suite with a nasty sneer. He had the nerve to look me dead in the eye and say it must be really nice to just kick back and live off Jamal's hard work. He chuckled and said not everyone gets a free ride in their golden years, especially when they come from nothing. The sheer audacity of this boy, whose own startup business was failing miserably, sitting in a home he did not pay for drinking tea he did not buy, and lecturing a black woman who had worked double shifts for 40 years about a free ride. My blood boiled so hot, I thought my chest would literally burst. I had paid for every single thing Jamal achieved with my own sweat, and this arrogant man was reducing my entire life of sacrifice to a lazy handout. I waited for Jamal to put a stop to it. Every time Brad made a snide remark, or every time Chloe handed me a mop instead of a proper greeting, I would look at my son. I would catch Jamal's eye across the room, waiting for the boy I raised to step up and be a man. I waited for him to say that nobody speaks to his mother that way. I waited for him to demand they put some respect on my name. But Jamal would just look away. He would clear his throat, suddenly find something very interesting on his cell phone, or make a weak excuse about needing to make a business call. When I finally cornered him in the kitchen one evening and asked him why he let his wife and brother-in-law disrespect me in his own home, Jamal let out a heavy sigh and told me I was being overly sensitive. He actually patted my shoulder and told me to just be grateful they had given me a nice roof over my head. Grateful. He wanted me to be grateful for a golden cage built entirely on disrespect. I swallowed my pride that evening and went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, looking at my worn hands, and wondered where I had gone wrong. I kept biting my tongue, desperately convincing myself that the stress of keeping up with his wife's extravagant lifestyle was temporarily blinding Jamal to my pain. I had no idea that my silence was only giving them permission to push me even closer to the edge. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when the house was completely empty. Chloe was out at one of her lavish spa days, and Jamal was at the office. I had decided to bake a sweet potato pie to bring some warmth into that sterile kitchen. I needed my grandmother's recipe card, the one I had given Jamal years ago when he moved into his first apartment. I remembered he kept a box of sentimental papers in his home office. I never went into his workspace, but I figured a quick search for a family recipe would not hurt. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door and walked toward his sleek glass desk. The office was impeccably neat, but a stack of mail sat haphazardly near his computer monitor. As I reached for a small storage box on the shelf, my sleeve caught the edge of the mail pile, sending a few envelopes scattering across the polished wood floor. I knelt down to gather them. That was when I saw it. One of the envelopes was already torn open, and the paper inside had slid out. It was a bank statement. But it was not from Jamal's usual bank. The logo at the top belonged to the credit union where I kept my standard retirement checking account. I frowned, feeling a strange flutter in my chest. I picked up the paper and unfolded it completely. My eyes scanned the lines of black ink, and my heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There, staring back at me, were the transaction records for the past 8 months. Every single one of my monthly retirement deposits had been immediately transferred out. The destination for every transaction was listed clearly as a joint account belonging to Jamal and Chloe. My legs suddenly felt like they were made of lead. I collapsed into the leather office chair, gripping the paper so tightly my knuckles turned white. I reviewed the dates, the amounts, the routing numbers. It was all there in undeniable black and white. For 8 months, my son had been systematically draining my retirement funds. I remembered the paperwork he had asked me to sign shortly after I moved in, claiming it was just routine documentations to update my emergency contacts for the hospital pension board. He had slipped a direct deposit authorization form into that stack. My own son had forged my financial consent to feed his wife's insatiable spending habits. A wave of physical nausea washed over me. I placed the statement back on the desk, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to believe there was some massive misunderstanding. But the evidence was right there. Just as I was trying to catch my breath, the screen of an iPad resting on the corner of the desk, lit up with a bright flash. A message notification popped up. The tablet was unlocked. I leaned closer, my eyes drawn to the name on the screen. It was a group chat between Chloe and her brother Brad. I tapped the screen, opening the message thread. What I read next eradicated any lingering trace of maternal denial I had left. Brad had sent a message asking if the old nurse's accounts were fully tapped out yet, because his startup investors were breathing down his neck. Chloe's response made the blood turn to absolute ice in my veins. She replied that Jamal had successfully diverted the last of the retirement checks that morning. She wrote that they were just biding their time until the end of the week, when they planned to dump the clueless old bat at the state-funded facility. She actually called me a clueless old bat. She went on to say that once I was locked away in the home, Jamal could easily declare me financially incompetent and liquidate whatever small savings I had left to fund Brad's failing business venture. Brad replied with a laughing emoji. He typed that it was about time the hired help paid her dues for living off them. He joked that I would probably thank them for putting me in a home where I belonged. I sat in that silent office, staring at the glowing screen. The deep, suffocating grief that had gripped my chest only moments before completely vanished. It evaporated into thin air. In its place, a cold, calculating clarity washed over my entire being. I had spent 40 years dealing with life and death situations in emergency rooms. I knew how to stabilize a crashing patient, and I certainly knew how to stop a hemorrhage. The tears I thought I would shed simply did not come. My son was not a victim of his wife's manipulation. He was a willing, active participant in my destruction. He had traded his mother's livelihood for a seat at a table of arrogant people who viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource. I took my cell phone out of my pocket. My hands were no longer shaking. I opened the camera and took clear, focused photographs of the bank statements. I took pictures of every single text message on the iPad, making sure the dates and times were perfectly visible. I documented their entire greedy conspiracy right there in the quiet of the afternoon. When I finished, I placed the bank statement exactly where I had found it. I locked the iPad screen and set it back on the corner of the glass desk. I smoothed out my blouse and walked out of the home office, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. I did not bake the sweet potato pie that afternoon. I went back to my guest suite and sat in the quiet. I was no longer a heartbroken mother mourning the loss of her son's affection. I was a formidable woman preparing for war. They thought they had drained me dry. They thought I was just a naive retired nurse with nothing left to her name. They had absolutely no idea about the blind trust. They had no idea about the real estate company. And they certainly had no idea that the very roof over their heads was legally mine. The evening of my discovery felt heavier than any double shift I had ever worked at the hospital. I sat on the edge of my bed in the guest suite, staring at the wall. The silence was deafening. Just after 8 o'clock, I heard their heavy footsteps coming down the hall. They knocked once and pushed the door open without waiting for an answer. Jamal stood tall, wearing a custom-tailored suit that I had unknowingly paid for with my stolen retirement checks. Chloe was right beside him. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and she was chewing on her bottom lip with a look of supreme impatience. They looked like two predators, ready to finish off their wounded prey. They truly thought they had drained my accounts dry, and that I was completely out of options. Jamal cleared his throat, avoiding my direct gaze. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto my bed. It was the exact same cheap state-funded nursing home brochure he had dropped at my feet on Thanksgiving morning. He looked down at me and announced that they had made a final decision. He told me that keeping me in the guest suite was becoming a massive financial burden on their future. He actually had the nerve to say that the lease on their luxury estate was incredibly expensive, and that providing for my daily needs was draining their savings. My own son, The boy whose diapers I changed and whose college tuition I paid in cash stood in my house and called me a financial burden. Chloe stepped forward with a fake pout that made my stomach physically churn. She sighed heavily and said it was absolutely nothing personal. She claimed they just needed space to breathe and focus on building their marriage. She said the nursing home was a highly practical choice for someone my age. She even had the audacity to say that it would be good for me to be around people in my own tax bracket. She whined that they were barely keeping their heads above water trying to support my lifestyle. My lifestyle. I lived in a single room, ate modest meals, and brewed my own tea while they were draining my life savings to fund European vacations and her brother failed business ventures. Then came the final crushing blow. Jamal looked at his expensive designer watch and delivered his ultimatum. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to pack my belongings. He stated he had already arranged for a cheap transport service to pick me up on Saturday morning. He warned me not to make a scene or cause any drama because they were hosting a massive farewell dinner party for Brad and their high society friends on Friday night. He told me I needed to be entirely packed and out of sight before the caterers arrived. He instructed his own mother to hide like a shameful secret in the very house I legally owned. 48 hours to erase 40 years of a mother-absolute devotion. I looked at the two of them standing there so incredibly smug and proud of their cruelty. A weaker woman might have screamed. A foolish woman might have confronted them right then and there with the truth. But I had spent decades in a chaotic emergency room. I knew exactly how to stay calm when the monitors were blaring. So I gave them exactly what they wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump forward. I let my breathing hitch. I forced a look of utter defeat onto my face, and I let the tears fall. Real hot tears streamed down my cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow or heartbreak. They were tears of pure, unadulterated rage. I buried my face in my trembling hands and nodded slowly, acting completely broken. I choked out a quiet apology, playing the part of the defeated old woman perfectly. I told Jamal I never meant to be a burden on his beautiful marriage. I whispered that I would start packing my things immediately and stay completely out of their way. Chloe smiled a wicked, satisfied smile and patted my shoulder lightly as if I were a stray dog they were sending to the pound. Jamal let out a long, heavy breath of relief, muttered a quick thank you, and turned on his heel. They walked out of my room and shut the door, leaving me alone with my tears. But the exact moment that door clicked shut, my tears stopped instantly. I stood up from the bed and wiped my face. My spirit turned to absolute ice. They wanted me gone in 48 hours. I decided right then and there that I would give them a Friday night dinner party they would remember for the rest of their miserable lives. The very next morning, while Jamal and Chloe slept off their expensive wine, I was already dressed and out the door before the sun fully breached the horizon. I did not shed another tear. Tears are for the helpless, and I was far from helpless. I drove straight downtown to the sleek glass-panelled office of my longtime legal counsel attorney, Marcus Davis. Marcus is a sharp, no-nonsense black man whose brilliant mind has overseen my blind trust and real estate limited liability company for over a decade. When I walked into his plush office, I did not look like a frail, discarded old woman. I walked in with my spine straight, my head held high, and a thick folder of highly incriminating evidence clutched firmly in my hand. Marcus greeted me with his usual warm smile, offering me a seat and a cup of black coffee. But his expression hardened into stone the moment I laid the photographs of the bank statements and the intercepted text messages out on his massive mahogany desk. I watched his eyes scan the documents. The undeniable proof of my own son forging my signature and rerouting my direct deposit retirement checks into his joint account with that dreadful wife of his. For a long moment, the only sound in the office was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He read the messages where they mocked me, where they called me a clueless old bat, and where they planned to drain me dry to fund Brad's failing startup business. Marcus looked up at me, his jaw set tightly, his professional demeanor struggling to mask his deep disgust. He asked me if I was absolutely certain about how I wanted to proceed, warning me that once we set the legal wheels in motion, the consequences for Jamal would be incredibly severe and completely irreversible. I looked my trusted attorney dead in the eye and told him that the boy I raised died the moment he decided my life savings were a convenient slush fund for his wife-brother. I told him I wanted no mercy, no hesitation, and absolutely no room for them to negotiate. We spent the next 4 hours meticulously compiling every single piece of evidence. Marcus pulled up the official deeds and the leasing agreements for the luxury estate, where Jamal and Chloe were currently residing. The very same estate they thought they were leasing from some faceless corporate entity, completely unaware that my limited liability company was the sole owner of the property. Marcus drafted the paperwork with surgical precision. We prepared immediate legally binding eviction notices, citing severe breach of contract and criminal financial activity. We did not stop there. Because Jamal had committed federal check fraud by forging my signature on those direct deposit authorization forms. Marcus immediately contacted my credit union fraud department. We drafted the emergency injunctions required to instantly freeze Jamal and Chloe joint bank accounts, severing their access to every single dime of my stolen money. The trap was set with airtight, ironclad legality. Marcus assured me that by the time Friday evening rolled around, my son and his greedy wife would not have access to a single penny, and they would be legally ordered to vacate my property. He promised to personally deliver the documents alongside local law enforcement to ensure there would be no misunderstanding. Leaving the law office that afternoon, stepping out into the crisp city air, I did not feel the crushing weight of a mother's sorrow. I felt an exhilarating, almost dangerous sense of absolute liberation. I was reclaiming my power, my dignity, and the fruits of my 40 years of relentless labor in the hospital wards. I drove back to the sprawling suburban estate with a quiet, icy resolve humming through my veins. The trap was fully loaded, the legal mechanisms were locked into place, and all I had to do now was play my part flawlessly for just a little while longer. I had to become the exact pathetic, broken woman they so desperately wanted me to be. I knew that the next 48 hours would require the performance of a lifetime. But I was ready. I was a mother who had survived double shifts, broken hearts, and the exhaustion of raising a child alone. Faking a few tears to secure my ultimate justice would be the easiest shift I had ever worked. For the next 48 hours, I moved through that massive luxury estate like a silent, obedient ghost. I did exactly what Jamal and Chloe demanded of me. I stayed completely out of their way. I spent my days quietly packing my belongings into the scuffed duffel bag Jamal had so callously dropped at my feet. I folded my modest clothes, my nursing scrubs, and my comfortable shoes with deliberate, slow movements. Every time Chloe happened to walk past my open door, I made sure she saw me wiping away a fake tear or letting my shoulders slump in total defeat. She would pause in the doorframe, smiling a wicked little smile of supreme satisfaction, before quickly walking away to continue planning her lavish Friday night event. The house was buzzing with a sickening energy of excitement and anticipation. Chloe and Jamal were pulling out all the stops for Brad's grand farewell dinner party. They had hired an expensive private chef, a full waitstaff, and a classical string quartet to entertain their high society friends. The entire party was supposed to be a massive celebration of their newfound financial freedom, and Brad's upcoming business venture, a venture completely funded by my stolen retirement money. I listened from the shadows of the hallway as Jamal loudly bragged on the phone to a colleague about how he had finally secured the ultimate investment capital to elevate his family status. I watched Brad strut through the marble foyer, carrying expensive bottles of vintage champagne, acting like a conquering king who had just struck gold. They were so blinded by their own greed and arrogance that they never once stopped to question my sudden compliance. They never wondered why the strong, independent black woman who had survived grueling hospital shifts and raised a son single-handedly was suddenly surrendering without a single fight. They simply believed their own lies. They believed I was weak-tired and entirely broken. On Friday evening, the estate was transformed into a dazzling spectacle of fake wealth and hollow prestige. The sweeping circular driveway, filled with expensive luxury cars, and the grand foyer echoed with the loud, obnoxious laughter of people who valued bank accounts over basic human decency. I remained confined to the guest suite, just as Jamal had strictly instructed. I sat on the edge of my stripped bed, my packed duffel bag resting on the floor beside me. I listened to the clinking of crystal glasses and the smooth jazz music drifting down the hallway. I could hear Chloe's shrill voice making a grand toast to Brad, celebrating his undeniable genius, and thanking Jamal for being such an incredible provider for their family. It took every ounce of my willpower to keep from laughing out loud at the absolute absurdity of it all. They were toasting to their massive success with my stolen money in a house that I legally owned, while treating me like a shameful, embarrassing secret locked away in the back room. The tension in my chest was thick, but it was no longer fueled by anxiety or maternal grief. It was the thrilling, electric tension of a seasoned hunter waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. I reached into my pocket and checked my cell phone screen. Marcus had texted me exactly 10 minutes prior, confirming that the joint bank accounts had been successfully and completely frozen, and that he was currently pulling up to the estate gates with 2 uniformed police officers. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm. I stood up, smoothed down the skirt of my simple black dress, and picked up my heavy duffel bag. Jamal had told me to be packed and ready to leave out the back door, so I would not embarrass them in front of their wealthy guests. I intended to leave all right, but I was certainly not going out the back door. I walked out of the guest suite, the duffel bag in my firm grip, and made my way straight down the main hallway toward the grand dining room. I could smell the rich aroma of the catered food and hear the sophisticated chatter of their elite friends. With every step I took, the cold iron resolve inside me hardened into an unbreakable shield. They wanted to discard me like trash, but I was about to show them exactly who held the power in this family. I was ready to bring their entire house of cards crashing down around them. The moment of their ultimate unmasking had finally arrived, and I was going to savor every single second of it. The grand dining room was a blinding display of excessive vanity and stolen wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table, where 24 of Chloe and Jamal, most pretentious friends, sat laughing and drinking expensive champagne. I stood just outside the heavy oak double doors, gripping my scuffed duffel bag in one hand and the thick manila folder attorney Marcus Davis had prepared for me in the other. I could see Brad standing at the head of the table, holding up a crystal flute of champagne, his face flushed with arrogance. He was in the middle of a grand, sweeping toast about Jamal proclaiming that my son was a true financial visionary who was about to launch their new business venture into the stratosphere. The guests murmured in polite agreement, clinking their glasses and showering my son with unearned admiration. Jamal sat there, soaking it all in, puffing out his chest with a sickeningly smug smile. Chloe leaned against his shoulder, looking like the queen of a castle she did not own. My heart did not ache. My hands did not tremble. The head nurse inside me took complete control of my spirit. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with a loud, resounding thud that immediately silenced the string quartet playing in the corner. Every single head in that dining room snapped toward me. The laughter died. I walked into the room, my head held high, my spine straight, dragging my scuffed duffel bag across their pristine imported rug. Jamal's smile vanished the second he saw me. The colour completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified little boy. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to her chest, as she frantically looked around at her wealthy friends, desperately trying to maintain her carefully constructed facade. She hissed at me through gritted teeth, asking what I was doing and demanding that I go back to my room immediately. She told the guests that I was just the confused elderly mother who had wandered out of bed. I did not retreat. I stepped right up to the head of the table where Brad was still holding his champagne flute, frozen in absolute shock. I looked at my son and told him in a voice so loud and clear it echoed off the vaulted ceilings that I was not confused, and I was certainly not going back to my room. At that exact moment, the front doors of the estate swung open. Attorney Marcus Davis strode into the dining room, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers. The guests began to murmur in panicked whispers. Marcus stood right beside me, exuding a calm, terrifying legal authority. Jamal shot up from his chair, demanding to know what was going on and why the police were in his house. I dropped my duffel bag and slammed the thick manila folder right onto the center of the dining table. I looked at the crowd of snobby elitists and then locked my eyes directly onto my son. I told him that he was absolutely right about one thing. He was definitely a financial visionary. I told the entire room that Jamal was such a visionary that he had managed to forge his own mother signature and reroute her hard-earned monthly retirement checks into his personal joint account for the past 8 months. The collective gasp from the guests was absolute music to my ears. People covered their mouths, whispering in horror, as the pristine image of Jamal and Chloe shattered into a million pieces right in front of their eyes. Jamal frantically shook his head, stammering and stuttering, trying to form a coherent sentence. He claimed it was a lie, a massive misunderstanding, and that I was just a sick old woman making up crazy stories. But Marcus Davis stepped forward, pulling the certified bank statements from the folder. He held them up for everyone to see, pointing out the direct deposit transfers, the forged signatures, and the exact routing numbers that linked straight to Jamal and Chloe bank accounts. Marcus announced in a booming voice that the evidence was completely irrefutable and that the bank had already frozen all of their assets due to ongoing federal check fraud investigations. Chloe let out a high-pitched shriek. She yelled that it did not matter because they still had their business venture and this massive estate. She screamed that they would just kick me out right then and there and call the police to have me arrested for trespassing in their home. I could not help but laugh. It was a deep, rich laugh that bubbled up from the very bottom of my soul. I looked at this foolish, arrogant girl and shook my head, telling her she could not kick me out of my own house. Chloe laughed a harsh, mocking laugh, asking me if my imaginary retirement checks had suddenly bought a multi-million-dollar suburban estate. Marcus calmly pulled the final document from the folder and laid the thick parchment paper on the table right in front of Jamal. I told my son to read the name of the limited liability company that owned the property. Jamal's hands shook violently as he picked up the paper. He read the name out loud, his voice cracking in terror. Clarice Holdings. I told him that I was the sole proprietor of Clarice Holdings. I explained that while he was busy pretending to be a rich man, using my stolen retirement funds to impress his fake friends, I had actually spent 40 years quietly building a massive real estate empire. I told him I owned the very ground he was standing on, the roof over his head and the walls that surrounded him. I told him that he was never the master of this house. He was just a terrible lying tenant who had severely breached his lease. The magnitude of this incredible revelation shattered their entire reality. It was a glorious moment of pure righteous justice. The utter shock and silence that enveloped the dining room was something I will savor for the rest of my days. The wealthy guests who had been drinking to my son's success moments before were now staring at him as if he were a diseased rat. The extravagant facade Jamal had spent months meticulously building shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of his elite circle. Jamal stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he stared at the master deed bearing my company name. He tried to stammer out an apology, his voice trembling and cracking as he desperately reached for my hand. He begged me to listen, saying we were family, and that we could fix this entire misunderstanding quietly without involving the authorities. I pulled my hand away from his grasp, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow pity for the pathetic man standing before me. Chloe shrieked in pure humiliation. Her face twisted into a pathetic mask of pure panic as the reality set in. She frantically looked at her high society friends, pleading with them not to believe the insane ramblings of a bitter old woman. But the guests were already backing away, averting their eyes and discreetly gathering their expensive coats and purses. Nobody wanted to be associated with a couple facing federal check fraud and public eviction. They filed out of the front doors in complete silence, abandoning Jamal and Chloe in their darkest moment of absolute ruin. While the chaos unfolded, I noticed Brad trying to quietly slip out the back door toward the garden terrace. But attorney Marcus Davis had anticipated every single rat in the maze. One of the uniformed police officers swiftly intercepted Brad, blocking the exit with a firm hand on his shoulder. The officer informed Brad that he was not going anywhere. He stated that the authorities had several critical questions regarding the funding for his startup business and his potential involvement in the systematic financial exploitation of a vulnerable, elderly citizen. Brad's face twisted in pure panic, his arrogant smirk replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror, as the officer instructed him to step back into the dining room for formal questioning. I turned my attention back to Jamal and Chloe, who were now clinging to each other in the center of the room, trembling like frightened children. Marcus Davis reached into the manila folder one final time and pulled out the legal eviction notice. He handed the crisp white document directly to Jamal, stating clearly that the lease had been instantly terminated due to criminal financial activity. He informed them that they had absolutely zero legal right to remain on the premises and that the police officers were there to ensure their immediate removal. Chloe burst into hysterical tears, dropping to her knees and pleading with me to give them a second chance. She begged me to remember that we were family. I looked down at the woman who had treated me like unpaid help, who had mocked me and called me a clueless old bat. I felt a surge of righteous vindication. I told her in a steady, icy voice that family does not forge signatures, steal retirement funds, or plot to abandon their mother in a rundown state facility. I told them they had exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings they could carry before the officers escorted them off my private property. I stood in the center of the grand foyer, watching closely as my son and his greedy wife frantically stuffed their designer clothes and expensive trinkets into cheap garbage bags under the watchful eyes of the police. Jamal looked at me one last time, his eyes filled with a desperate, agonizing regret. He softly called out for his mother, but I did not answer. The woman he knew was gone. The police officers escorted Jamal, Chloe, and a terrified Brad out the heavy oak front doors. I followed them out onto the sweeping circular driveway, watching as they were unceremoniously dumped onto the curb outside the massive iron gates. They stood there shivering in the cool night air, clutching their garbage bags with absolutely nothing left to their names. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt a profound, immense relief. I turned around, walked back inside the magnificent luxury estate, and firmly locked the heavy oak doors behind me. The extravagant house was finally empty. I stood alone in the grand marble foyer, breathing in the crisp air. The silence that filled the space was no longer suffocating or oppressive. It was a peaceful, deafening silence of absolute freedom. My son had drained every cent he could to play pretend, but in the end, I was the one who truly owned the kingdom. And that is the honest truth, folks. I gave that boy my whole entire heart, and he literally tried to sell it for a cheap designer watch. But what they did not know is that an educated, fully prepared black woman is the most formidable force on this earth. I reclaimed my peace, my home, and my dignity. Sometimes you really just have to step back and let the trash take itself out to the curb. I built my kingdom with my own 2 hands, and no one will ever take that away from me. If this story resonated with your spirit, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel for more true stories of survival, justice, and reclaiming your power. I truly want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly where you are watching from today, what time it is in your city, and what you would have done if you were standing in my shoes. I am always reading your thoughts. Stay blessed, stay strong, and always stay smart out there, ladies. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, please protect your inner peace today, wonderful ladies.